Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming here early on a Tuesday morning. Welcome to the McCain Institute in our new home, 18th and I. It's the ASU building. We have a number of elements in Arizona State University here, and the McCain Institute housed here as well. And we're delighted to have a conversation this morning with George Osborne. As you know, George was the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the British government for 20 years. He is now the editor of Reading Standard. He is also, among a number of other things, the inaugural Kissinger Fellow of the McCain Institute. We have another local board next year. We wanted to take advantage of George's presence here in Washington to have a conversation on a topic that I think is on a lot of people's minds, which is what next? We have populism, democracy. How's it look from the UK? What's happening there? What's happening here? And where do you see this going? I think George's approach of both having been a very senior level government, a leader in the Rename campaign, and now looking at things from the perspective of the editor of a major British newspaper, and I just learned this morning one with growing circulation as well, which is unique among newspapers in the world. So there's a lot to talk about. I'd like to kick it off with George and just start a conversation, but I'd like to bring you in as we go and develop a lot of different themes and questions. And there are a few real experts in this topic in the audience as well, so I want to make sure we get some perspective from them. But the first question that I wanted to ask George, is there a turning point ahead? If you think about, what we've seen with the development of populist movements, whether it's Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, the Brexit movement in the UK, our own election here, is there a buyer's remorse, or do you see a change coming, or is this something that a new reality we need to be adapting to?
Well, Kurt, everyone, it's great to be here, and I've really enjoyed my association with the McCain Institute and getting to know the Senator even better than I did already, but also working with the team at the Institute, and the good work that you do. And so I'm glad we have time to get together while I'm here in Washington. Let me, I don't know if the sound is working, but it's a small room, we can go. The short answer to your question is, we don't know, right? We don't know whether all of these different things that you identified, and of course, each one would vehemently deny that they were in any way connected with each other. But the rest of the world sees things connected. Because they're all, in effect, nativist movements. They're all assertions of national identity and national character. And thank you. So they would all deny, the populist right in Germany, the Trump election here, Brexit. They would all deny that they're connected, and indeed vehemently do. But outside of the individual countries, they're all seen as very much connected. And we don't know whether this is the beginning of the disintegration of essentially the kind of normal political arrangements that we've seen since the war, Second World War, and the beginning of a whole new set of movements based around more aggressive assertion, I guess, of national identity, or this is more of a passing phase. I think a kind of historian looking back on this period would not have too much difficulty identifying a couple of key features. The first is there was an economic crash in 2008, and we're 10 years on from it now, and it was as big. Shock the country's had since the Great Depression. And so you would expect that to spill over into the political system, for there to be a reaction. Second, you have also had a the historian of technology as well, a big disruption in these companies like Facebook barely existed at the time, 10 years ago, but they have provided essentially the same kind of disruption to the political industry as they have already provided to the books industry or the music industry or the newspaper industry, and they've allowed start-up campaigns, if you like, to reach large numbers of people in a way that simply wouldn't have been possible. So you could run for the presidency of the United States really off your mobile phone, rather than having to construct an enormous nationwide campaign and spend $1 billion doing so.
So that's a little bit of the economic reality and a little bit of the method. There's an issue here that I think seems to connect some of these movements, though, which is people feeling that their identities are somehow under threat. Paradoxically, perhaps, but they feel it. And so they want some protection. They want to rally around whatever nationalism or identity issue makes them feel more comfortable. What's driving that, and is that different than in the past, or what's going on there?
Well, I think the economic backdrop of an economic crash, for example, does mean that people will look for things to blame, look for reasons why the system is not working for them, and not everyone by any means, but some people will turn to outsiders and say, well, it's because, for example, immigrants are coming in and taking our jobs, even if there's no evidence at all that that is the case. And at the same time, as I say, the new technology can be exploited essentially by sort of start-up populist movements that can get going very quickly and get a lot more traction than would have been the case in the past. So those things come together. Look, I think obviously there's a rapid pace of change taking place in society, but that is not unique to this period of history, nor is it unique to have people fear outsiders. There's been a long history in the United States and Britain and elsewhere of anti-immigrant movements, resistance to cultural change. The question is how you respond to that. In the past, sometimes it was appeased, sometimes it was confronted. I guess my view, personally, as a conservative, centre-right politician, who nevertheless believes there are enormous economic benefits, for example, from immigration and integration and global cooperation, that it should be confronted a bit more and appeased a bit less.
So that's an interesting point of view. So let's unpack that for a second. The Remain, of which you were a vital part, did not succeed in the referendum, and the Brexit did succeed in the referendum. I doubt, knowing you, that you were a slouch in the Remain campaign. I think you were probably doing everything humanly possible. And yet that didn't work. You now look at the government in the UK that seems to be embracing, okay, we voted Brexit, we're going to do it, but it still seems very muddled and very unclear. You seem to be advocating just now that we should fight more for what we really think and take on some of the populist ideology and movement and national ideology. Is that going to work, or is that going to alienate the government even more? Or another way to put it is the problem that elites are not leading on the right policies strongly enough, or is the problem that they are not listening enough to what people are concerned about?
Well, let me start with the specific and then kind of generalise. I mean, so there was a referendum on Britain's membership of the European Union. I was a very senior member of the government that held that referendum. I wasn't overly keen on having a referendum, but I was collectively bound to the decision we took to have one. It had been quite a long time coming in Britain. There was a referendum party in Britain in the 1990s. Tony Blair had promised a referendum, John Major had promised a referendum on various aspects of European politics. So it had all been kind of brewing. We then, the Remain side, lost the referendum by 52% to 48. And my contention then is that, and this is expressed in the editorials of the London Evening Standard, that you didn't have, there are various ways to leave the European Union. You don't have to go for the entire, sort of entirely the view that you've got to separate from everything. Reflection of a result which is 52-48. And personally, I would suggest that the reason why the government's in a huge amount of trouble politically is because it took a kind of absolutist interpretation, which is we have to leave all of the economic arrangements, such as the single market, the customs union, and so on. A view which, by the way, increasingly looks like it's not even going to prevail in the United Kingdom and in the House of Commons, but we will see. Coming back to your kind of therefore broader point, which is, should we listen a little more? Is it the elites being out of touch? Well, in the end, what is the job of a political system? It's ultimately to deliver, peace, security, prosperity, because you certainly notice the absence of the alternatives. You certainly notice the alternatives. Yes, try and forge a kind of common national purpose, ideally, increasingly difficult to do. I don't think these are, of course, I think it's a kind of lazy language to say there are elites and there are the others. It's a much more complex situation like that. One of the ironies, of course, in Britain is that the rebels are now in charge and, looking a little flustered at the prospect. I think you've just got to stay focused on the basics, which is, are you trying to deliver the maximum number of jobs, the biggest increase in real earnings you can deliver? Can you spread capital more widely amongst the labour force? Can you provide security in retirement, good education? I know that all sounds a bit prosaic, but that is the bread and butter of politics, and I think sometimes we forget it. And actually, one of the great, in my view, tragedies of Brexit in my country is that the opportunity cost, the enormous effort that for the next decade is going to go into essentially trying to regrade what we had, to a lesser degree, is is a lost opportunity to actually deal with the real challenges you've got, which are, in the age of technological change, are you going to provide good jobs for people, and are the robots and artificial intelligence machines going to take all the work? I don't think so, but nevertheless, how do you equip your populations for that? And those are the ways best to address, I think, some of this perfectly reasonable concern people have about their future economic prosperity, which sometimes spills into a concern about national identity.
I want to bring in members of the audience as well, so do get my attention. Let me ask this question while people think about what they would like to bring up. What do you see as, over the next, what is it now, 13, 14 months? What's the likely,
12 months.
12 months now. So what's the likely outcome here? How is this going to play out now in Britain?
Well, I think the kind of landing zone is a bit clearer than it was. There are two, if you think of Brexit in three stages. First of all, there's the divorce. So we've agreed the divorce terms. We're going to pay 50 billion euros for the privilege of leaving the European Union, and agree to give EU citizens their rights, those who live in Britain, quite correctly in my view. That's the first stage, that's sort of been agreed. Second, there's an agreement to what's called a transition, which is, we can't actually work out what our end state is, so will you give us at least continuity of the current regime until we have worked that out? That's being negotiated at the moment. I suspect the European Union, and it's already clear from some of the draft texts that have emerged, just going to insist on agreeing to all European Union terms and conditions, with the one exception, which is we're going to leave the room. So you're no longer going to have a British Chancellor sitting at the ECOFIN or a British Prime Minister sitting at the European Council. And then there's the third thing, which is very much being debated at the moment in Britain about what the kind of end state is that you transition to over a period of years. And that's the kind of free trade agreement, or the membership of the customs union, or the membership of the single market, which is up for debate. The kind of tail outcomes, one that Britain doesn't leave the European Union, seems to be pretty unlikely now, because both major political parties in Britain are committed to leaving, and in that sense respecting the outcome of the referendum. And I think the kind of very hard departure with no deal, just crashing out, leaving the EU, also now looks very unlikely. So you're all in this sort of space of exactly how close Britain wants to be to its European neighbours. And of course, when you actually start to look at the individual things, which is, well, we want to work together on climate change policy, and we're going to cooperate with each other to arrest criminals, and we want to be able to agree common standards for car production, and by the way, we don't want any tariffs at our border. You know, you put all those things together, and there was a solution to all those problems. It was called the European Union. And now we're basically kind of trying to find something that does not involve membership of the European Union, that achieves the same outcomes, albeit, I suspect, to a lesser degree.
On a sovereign basis.
Well, sovereignty, you know, we have, I think, conclusively proved we were always sovereign because we decided to leave the EU, which a sovereign nation could, only a sovereign nation could choose to do. So we've at least satisfied that concern.
It does sound like you said, okay, it's simple, 1, 2, 3, but everything is kind of packed into 3, and 3 is transition, and 3 is longer than a year.
That's why transition keeps. But you know, in the various years that I went to European meetings, I was there throughout the kind of Euro crisis, decision about kicking Greece out of the Euro, which of course in the end they didn't do. Always the simplest thing at a European meeting is to delay the decision. And the easiest outcome is to say, give it another 6 months at the crunch moment. And so I suspect that this transition, once you're in it, the easiest thing to do will always be to say, well, let's just extend it a bit, because we can't quite agree on the perfect long-term relationship.
Okay, I'm going to first start. Walter, would you, Walter Russell Mead, one of our great historians in this country these days.
It's a little bit like when they called, somebody said they would like being the tallest building in Wichita. Thing of Dean Acheson in the 60s saying Britain had lost an empire but hasn't found a role. One can argue that's still what we're looking at now. It's that tried up through the 70s to find an international role to play outside the European Union, then tried, at times fairly successfully, but never sort of permanently, to find a role inside the European Union that satisfied Britain's sort of sense of itself or whatever. Now it looks like we're kind of going back almost to scratch. What can be Britain's role in the world?
First of all, it's very good to have you here, and I admire much of what you've written. And you know, as it happens, yesterday I was thinking of the Dean Acheson quote, and I have a hand in the editorials of the Evening Standard, and I was thinking we must write one of our editorials. Britain has always found itself in the modern era as a sort of mid-Atlantic power, both a member of the European Union and a European nation, and at the same time sees itself as the United States' closest ally, and a kind of common champion of Anglo-Saxon capitalism and liberal international order. And the main job of a British Prime Minister in the foreign policy sphere has been to avoid having to choose between Washington and Brussels. It does occasionally come to a choice. So the Iraq War was perhaps the most recent obvious example where the British Prime Minister was ultimately forced, although he didn't want to make that choice, to side with the United States against France that exercised its veto in the UN. But British foreign policy has largely been about trying to avoid that crunch moment. And when it comes, probably with the exception of one British Prime Minister in the early 1970s, Ted Heath, all British Prime Ministers would have ultimately chosen Washington over Brussels if it came to it. And that has been Britain's role, you know, prominent membership of the IMF, the UN, the World Bank, a promoter of free trade and open societies, a liberal, in the European sense, economic reformer at Brussels, a tempering voice in Washington, and trying to to use the phrase of the British Foreign Secretary in the early 90s, punching above its weight. And personally, I thought we were doing not a bad job of that. And we had also opted out of the key components of European Union membership that were likely to cause us the most stress, because they involved overt acts of political integration, like the membership of the Euro and in particular, but also membership of the common border area, the Schengen border. But that was not, ultimately satisfactory to 52% of the population. And now we find ourselves, I think, in an ultimately unsustainable alliance between a small number of free traders. So if you meet the Brexit leadership, the senior members of the British Cabinet who were in favour of Brexit, of course most members of the British Cabinet were not in favour of Brexit, and most members of Parliament were not in favour of Brexit. But those who were say, and come and sit here and go, Britain should be a global, free trading Britain that's doing trade deals with the United States and China and all that kind of thing. The problem is, that is not what 17 million people voted for with Brexit. Right, the people of these towns, I don't know if you know them, but kind of Doncaster and the Sunderland in the northeast of England, and Port Talbot, the big steelworks in South Wales, they were not voting for some free trade deal with China. Right, that is not what they're, fed up with this European Union custom. What I want is, let's have some more Chinese steel and let's get those US corporates bidding for our National Health Service contracts. And that is. That alliance is ultimately unsustainable. It hasn't yet completely fractured, but it is fracturing. And I think Britain will end up trying to recreate, I'm sure if you come back in 50 years' time and say, well, Britain sort of built its way back into, not membership of the EU, but alliances with the EU, bilateral deals with the EU, which didn't look so completely dissimilar to what we had today, although crucially not.
If I could follow up. Or,
Yes. Sorry.
Right, because it was interesting to me to see, in a sense, if you look at British history, the core competence of Britain for hundreds of years was to keep Europe divided,
yes,
maintain a kind of a balance of power. And one would have hoped they would have been able to do that sort of within the EU structure. But partly because the Franco-German relationship kept being impervious to that. But also I think because Britain was never able to identify a set of consistent large enough set of consistent allies. So with the Eastern countries where there's a very natural link between a lot of what they're interested in and what the UK is interested in, we're never in Britain you couldn't really sort of pay the price for Poland, which would have been to continue to support free movement of Poles and others across the EU and sort of build a bloc that could then become a really consistent working group at Brussels. And even in the final negotiations over the referendum, the terms that will be voted on, not able to get quite enough to reverse the results of the referendum. And so that's what I mean in the sense of I agree with you about the sort of mid-Atlantic aspiration and really some of the very significant things Britain has done inside the EU. I mean, enlargement was really a British project.
and the single market.
Yes. I think if Charles de Gaulle could come back and be with us today, he would say he told you Britain would be the Trojan horse. And what happened was the Trojan horse went in, pushed enlargement to the point that the EU could no longer fulfill the original sort of vision of the EU, and then its work accomplished, its wreckage complete. The Trojan horse is now exiting the building.
Back to kilometres of yeah, well, so you're completely right about kind of classic British foreign policy, which was divide and rule. You pay the Prussians to fight the French, and then you pay the French to fight the Prussians, and you kept traditionally a very small army and a large navy, and that was British foreign policy for several hundred years. I think there's still a sort of residue of that survives today, where there's a sort of belief that you can pick off different members of the European Union and create some sort of counterblock to the Franco-German axis, which is in itself, by the way, a rather remarkable creation of post-war history. And that has not worked. It hasn't worked in these Brexit negotiations. I think there was a sort of constant illusion that you could, perhaps get the Poles to recognise the security contribution that Britain made, or persuade the Estonians that they wanted us in the. That has not really worked. The European unions were retained remarkable discipline in these negotiations, in marked contrast, I would suggest, to the British politics. Where does that kind of leave? Did the European Union not let Britain in? There were determined efforts to, by, for example, Tony Blair, to turn the Franco-German axis into a British-German Franco axis. That didn't work, but that's ultimately because we chose not to be part of the central political project that the EU became, the Eurozone. And I think we found actually therefore a rather comfortable resting place as it happens, not in the Eurozone but in the EU. But ultimately that was not satisfactory to the British population. Going forward, of course, we're still going to have all these relationships with our near neighbours. They're just not going to be, in my view, we're not going to be as influential in those relationships as we're going to be part of the EU, but it doesn't change the dynamic that we are a European country. And the one thing I'd say that I think was sort of challenged by the referendum result, but I don't think has been sort of determined yet, and I speak now as the editor of the big London newspaper, is I think Britain has seen itself as the big internationalist nation as well. London is arguably the most international city in the world, more so even than New York, for example. It's the kind of diversity of the population there, the global reach. It's not the European citizens only who contribute to that, or indeed American citizens. We have now a large Somali population in Britain, a growing Chinese population, so big links to the Middle East and Russia. So it's it's that kind of internationalist view of Britain, to a degree, has been challenged by the referendum result. And of course, the referendum result was very geographically divisive in the sense that London voted, and London's 20% of the population of the UK, so it's think of it as a combination of kind of New York, Washington, and LA in the British context. And it voted strongly to remain in the EU and was sort of challenged by places left behind, coastal communities, rural communities, sort of tired industrial towns that felt left behind by globalisation and I guess didn't sort of sign up to this more internationalist view.
Interesting. Jim Goldgard, former Dean of American University's School of International Service and the Council on Foreign Relations, and probably other hats as well that I don't know about.
Thanks. Well, yes, I'm at CFR, and everybody at CFR is missing the McCain Institute, but thrilled that you've been able to move up the street to this fantastic new space, so congratulations. So my question is, as you know, we're tied up in knots in this town right now regarding the role of Russia in the 2016 election and potential interference in the upcoming elections, and there's been a lot of discussion about Russia's role in various European elections, including the French, the German, the Catalonia referendum, and involvement in Brexit. And my question is, do you see a potential for coordination among the different countries in terms of how to respond to the Russian efforts to undermine the West, or do you see each country trying to just figure out on its own what role Russia is playing in their national space and then trying to respond? What's the conversation like post-Brexit about Russia's role in the UK?
Well, the first kind of interesting observation is whether you think any of these interventions were effective, or whether you think Facebook ads made any difference in the US presidential election, for example. What's quite interesting is the sides that Russia picks. Whether it succeeds in in its efforts to destabilise things, it nevertheless identifies, you know, a Trump victory, a Brexit victory, a Marine Le Pen victory as conducive to Russian foreign policy because it fragments the West. So this is the sort of first observation. Second, you know, we shouldn't. There's always a danger, I think, in life of overestimating your opponents as well as underestimating them. So, you know, Russia's got a huge number of problems, and they're not this kind of. We've got to be careful that, you know, we don't attribute to them decisive say in our various elections across the West. And I don't think they were decisive in any of these elections, even if they were disruptive. Third point I make is that, yes, collective response is important, both in terms of the sort of Western alliance, and actually, since President Trump's election, the number of US troops on the NATO mission in Western Europe has actually increased. That's the first 4 years, and that's just NATO. But, so, despite the campaign rhetoric, actually, there's been an increased US commitment to the Western alliance and the defence of Europe, and that is a good thing, and feels at the moment like it's checked Russian ambition in Eastern Europe. But at the same time, collectively in the West, we withdrew from the Middle East, not under the Trump administration, but the previous administration, and for the first time since Henry Kissinger kicked them out, the Russians are back in the Middle East. So, you know, and they are a more, you know, arguably, with our Syrian peace talks, which I know no one really cares what the US administration or the British government or the French government think about that. These are all negotiations being conducted between Moscow and Ankara and Tehran and so on, and Damascus. The final thing I'd say, which maybe is a bit counterintuitive, is I don't think the kind of basic instinct, which is we should try and get a better relationship with Russia, is a bad one. And any new US administration would try to do that, as any new British government has sought to do. And Britain often has worse relations with Russia even than the US. But of course, you know, the whole, and I won't get into it all, you know, you know much more about it than me, but you know, the whole kind of investigation into the Russian role in the Trump administration has actually prevented a perfectly sensible reset that might have taken place if you arrive at a new administration where you consider Trump. And that, in my mind, is a bit of a mistake.
Interesting. Do you have a follow-up, Jim? Okay. Let me pick up another country. One of our guests here this morning is the ambassador of Hungary to the United States, Mr. Noza.
Thank you very much.
Do you have a question? Or?
I do have. Thank you very much, Kurt. And this is related to transatlantic relations. How do you think, what will be the role of the UK in building, nurturing, enhancing transatlantic relations between the United States and the European Union? Can you build a bridge if you are also out of the European Union?
Well, I'm partly Hungarian, so it's always good to have the Hungarian ambassador. Well, I remember the French ambassador to Britain saying Britain keeps wanting to be a bridge between Europe and America, and the problem with bridges is that people walk over them. I think it's interesting, almost any US administration other than Donald Trump, by which I mean both the Hillary Clinton administration or the Jeb Bush administration or any of the other most of the other Republican candidates who ran in the primary, I think broadly would have sided with the European Union in these negotiations and put pressure on Britain to come to some kind of accommodation, and indeed probably played a kind of more convening role in the way I saw Barack Obama play over the Euro crisis of trying to get Europe and Britain, European countries to sort out their differences. The Trump administration is not playing that role at all, partly because, of course, Trump himself and the people around Trump identify Brexit as part of the same movement that they represent. And partly that's just not the style of this administration to do that kind of international brokering, certainly on the European stage. So you're not finding the United States involved in Brexit in the way that you might have done under another administration. And you're not seeing actually the United States play the role that I think some Brexiteers hoped, which was because they identified with Brexit, putting pressure on Europeans to cut a good deal for Britain. But you do not see Donald Trump picking up the phone to Angela Merkel to say, come on, cut this guy's a deal. So they're not part of that conversation. I mean, going forward, I think Britain, will still, indeed, arguably with Brexit, even more so, place a great deal of weight on its relationship with the United States, and insist on calling it a special relationship, and all of that. And it is a genuinely deep relationship. I saw that firsthand in government, and almost unique. We have a very close relationship with Canada and Australia as well, but it's a very, very deep relationship and involves, sharing information at the most classified, the highest level, which we do not do in the same degree with the Europeans, even though we're in the EU. So, I think Britain will still want to see itself as that kind of Atlantic power. What it will be much less, though, is an interpreter of Europe to the United States, or a way for the United States to influence Europe. I think you will see stronger, regardless of which administration, you will see stronger relations develop. They already were developing between the United States and France, the United States and Germany, already very strong anyway, but that will now be the principal route into influencing EU decision.
I want to ask, following up on Hungary, within the continent, within Europe, you have populist movements. You mentioned with Donald Trump, perhaps he has more populist tweeting, but policies more orthodox. In Europe, you have governments in Hungary or in Poland, or the election taking place in Italy this weekend that will probably turn in a combination right of center-right plus five-star movement government there. Are these popular movements qualitatively different? Are they threatening to Europe in any way? Are they changing democracy?
Well, I think I don't think they're qualitatively different. They're all part of a sort of similar trend, which is a sort of nativist response to economic underperformance, large-scale immigration, sense of cultural change. I think there's a sort of underreported or underanalyzed aspect of Brexit, which is Britain was the big non-Euro member of the EU. And if you're not in the Euro, the EU is going to be a more difficult place for you with Britain gone. Now, there were two groups of non-Euro countries. The first were the Scandinavians, so there's Denmark and Sweden. And I've travelled quite a bit to Copenhagen and Stockholm. They are very, very anxious about Brexit because they're essentially similar sort of advanced Western economies that relied on Britain to a degree to defend the interests of those who were not in the Euro inside the European Union. And over time, on a whole host of things, you will see, like, for example, banking regulation, pressure on these small non-Euro members like Denmark and Sweden. Then there's another group, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Eastern European countries that aren't in the Euro and in theory are committed to joining, although it's not going to happen anytime soon. And I think increasingly, partly because of the nationalist governments that have been elected in these countries, first in Hungary but now in Poland, and in the Czech Republic, you will actually see the Eurozone increasingly just sort of deal with that problem by focusing on the Eurozone. And they will find themselves marginalised through lack of attention, a lack of interest, and a lack of dealing with things at an EU level rather than a Eurozone. And that's a sort of curious feature of Brexit that one of these, the big non-Euro member has gone.
And we're worried about Germany because the two main parties of the Grand Coalition are locked in a death grip here because if they don't, they're going to face another election that's going to see even further losses for both parties and possibly the inability to even have a majority anymore. What's going on there, and what do you think happens in Germany looking forward?
Yeah, I mean, first I'd observe it's never a very good thing when a government's terrified of an election. But,
what would that be like?
So the story in Europe, it's all Macron, right? If you go, to around European capitals, they'll all talk about President Macron, Paris. France is back doing what it has always traditionally done in the EU, which is provide the kind of grand projet, the political leadership that was harnessed to German economic strength. I think that's actually quite a good thing, because I noticed in the 6 years I was Chancellor from 2010 to 2016, a big diminution of French influence and clout at the table, and Germany really becoming the absolute dominant European nation, which I thought personally was a little bit unhealthy, because it meant that everyone's bilateral relationship with Germany was always more important than the collective decision that was being made, and that enabled Germany to get its way more often than I think was good for Europe. I think it's not a bad thing to have a bit of French influence back there. At the same time, of course, German influence will diminish as they've got their internal domestic problems. I'm not sure, I'm not an expert on German politics, I don't know where it's going to lead. But I would observe that generally, centre-left, a lot of the focus has been on the Conservative side of the debate. We've talked here, you've got the debate about the alt-right and, the country club Republicans versus the Bannon types and all that. And in Britain, it's, the big sort of psychodrama has been sort of playing out inside the Conservative Party, the Brexit people and the Remain people and so on. But actually, one of the great forces of the last 10 years has been the collapse of social democracy and the collapse of the centre-left across Europe. So the French socialists, now, I can't remember what they're voting, but virtually nothing. German Social Democrats, the British Labour Party captured by Marxists. It's interesting that the kind of combination of sort of economic underperformance and cultural change and immigration and all that, classic social democracy, which was after all in the ascendant in the 1990s, with Bill Clinton and Tony Blair and all this, has largely evaporated.
Interesting. Do we have other audience?
Colonel, I'm looking at our policy design students, and I guarantee you they have a question in there, but I'll ask one while they're thinking of one. I'm curious, your view on what's the name of the game in media as an enterprise, is making media work as an enterprise, and then also, do you feel or have a view about freedom of the press being somewhat under pressure or confused, either transatlantically or globally, however you'd like to speak to it?
Yeah, well, I took an unusual career decision after leaving government, which was to go and edit a big newspaper, which is, a great challenge, and I'm enjoying it a lot, and it's a good team, and we're a big newspaper. We have close to 1 million readers, close to 1 million copies every day distributed in London. In a way, this happened before I arrived there, we dealt with the challenge of the internet to the economic model by handing the paper out for free. So it's a quality publication where you can read, learned essays on what's going on in Syria, but it's handed to you for free as you travel on the subway in London. And of course, the subway in London is used by millions of people, and it's very sort of democratic and classless. And it's in pretty good shape. Pretty good health, and it kind of got ahead of the disruption that the internet has brought to the traditional media model. Personally, I wouldn't. I've various things I could have done with my life. I wouldn't have gone into this industry if I didn't think it's an important industry with a future. Because in the end, I think people like myself and people in this room are always going to want well-informed, well-sourced opinion and facts and information. And we'll sort of find ways of doing it, but what's interesting to me is the renaissance here in the US of papers like the Washington Post and the New York Times, partly driven, I suspect, off the kind of Trump fervor, but also because they're being clever with their distribution models and their internet presence. As for the sort of challenge to the freedom of the press, I think there may be individual instances of that in different countries, but broadly I see a pretty free and free-ranging media at the moment. I think the interesting coming issue is going to be the regulation of social media. You see this in the American political debate, you see it in Britain and in Europe. The Facebooks of this world, are they going to get away with saying they're not editors? I suspect not. I mean, I'm an editor and I make a daily decision about what my readers see and whether I challenge those opinions or reinforce those opinions. Seems to be the Facebook algorithms are doing something pretty similar. Then you've got questions of the sort of monopoly power of some of the big search companies like Google, and whether it's the European Commission or Washington. There's an interesting argument developing in politics that the agglomeration of these companies is undermining productivity and competitiveness, and you see that being socialised in the US debate at the moment. The Ubers and the like of this world are coming to terms with the fact that you can't just simply say these people don't work for us and expect the state to pick up maternity benefits, sickness benefits, retirement benefits. And so we're going to see changes to employment status. There's a legislation in the British Parliament at the moment, not inspired by the government, but nevertheless a challenge, which is we should have a register of Airbnb properties in London, because what about people who live in London who can't get a decent home? So I think all of that is coming. I'm sort of broadening the question out of it, and I think one of the issues as a conservative, on the centre-right British politics and the kind of global policy debate, what's the conservative response to those things? Where's a good conservative argument in that? Rather than just saying laissez-faire, which was never, of course, that's not actually true to the free market conservative tradition, as Teddy Roosevelt would attest.
Is there a question from students in the audience? Yes.
My name is David. I'm intern at the McCain Institute, and we're very happy to be here at the policy design class. And what we always discuss in our class is how major events shape international policy. And one thing that I would like to ask on the Brexit move, we have young democracies, for example, let's say Africa, who really look into what happens in the Western world. So on the Brexit side, how does the move from the European Union to Britain shape international policies to the young democracies like in Africa, and how does it influences, for example, these young democracies which are forming regional integration? Does it really influence the way they view on the integration within regional countries?
Well, the stated aim of the government is that post-Brexit we strengthen our ties with the rest of the world, including Africa, and we make use of other international organisations that we're part of, including the Commonwealth, which many African countries are members of, and indeed new African countries have joined, like Rwanda. So that would be the stated policy goal. I think what's interesting is that I've seen the state of Africa, if you like, has moved from being 20 years ago largely a development concern. What could you do to provide development assistance or vaccination programs to African countries? And has become a much more central debate about how you grow these African economies, what are the commercial opportunities for Western economies in Africa, what is the challenge that China presents because of its very aggressive investment strategy in Africa, sometimes with less strings attached. And then all of it feeds into the kind of big debate Europe's having about migration and how you manage the movements of populations, of which the only sort of workable long-term solution that anyone's come up with is try and make these African economies stronger, more prosperous, with higher GDP per capita, so that people don't feel the need to move to improve their family's economic circumstances. So Africa has become a much more central issue. in Western European political debates, including in Britain, because it touches on economic prosperity, migration, security, and all of that. And that, you know, I think actually from an African point of view, that's a positive development because it's sort of come out of the sort of aid bit over there in the government, but into the more mainstream conversation.
All right, final question from me and we'll wrap up. You demonstrated that there was a pathway from government to becoming a newspaper editor. Is there a pathway from being a newspaper editor to government?
Well, of course, you know, there have actually been various editors of the Evening Standard who went into politics. No, I had a very good time in British politics. I'm very much enjoying my life at the moment. I think my former colleagues in the government would not say I'm entirely conversation. And I keep my options open. I could return if I felt that was the right thing to do. But I'm not, you know, at age 46, having been Chancellor for 6 years, it's quite tempting to go off and try some new things, which is what I'm doing here.
Very good. Well, thank you for your time and thanks for sharing your thoughts.